The alarm never went off. Ryder Cole was already awake. He stood over the stove at 5:48 a.m., flipping a pancake with one hand while tucking his shirt into his slacks with the other. The kitchen smelled like maple syrup and burnt coffee. A backpack sat open on the counter, half-packed. A permission slip he'd signed at midnight was clipped to the front zipper. From down the hall came the sound of small feet hitting hardwood. Piper appeared in the doorway, 8 years old, hair a total disaster, one sock on and one sock missing. She looked at the pancake, then at her father, then back at the pancake. "You made the ones with the edges?" she asked. "Crispy edges," Ryder said. "Just how you like them." She climbed onto the stool and grabbed the syrup before he'd even plated it. He watched her for exactly 3 seconds, the only 3 seconds that morning where nothing was urgent. Then his phone buzzed, then buzzed again. A work notification. He flipped it face down without reading it. Breakfast first. Everything else could wait 4 minutes. By 6:12 a.m., Piper's hair was brushed, her lunch was packed, and they were pulling out of the driveway. She talked the entire ride about her science project, about a boy named Marcus who kept stealing her eraser, about whether clouds had feelings. Ryder answered every question fully. Not halfway, not distracted fully. He dropped her at the front steps of Garfield Elementary at 6:29 a.m. She jumped out, turned back, and pointed at him. "Pick me up on time today, Dad." "Always do," he said. She disappeared through the doors. The smile stayed on his face for exactly 1 block. Then the weight returned. The commute, the overtime request sitting in his inbox, the mortgage payment due Friday, the babysitter who'd already texted asking about her schedule. He merged onto the highway and pressed the coffee cup against his lips, even though it had gone cold 20 minutes ago. If you've ever watched someone carry more than any one person should have to carry, and do it without a single word of complaint, then you already understand Ryder Cole before he ever walks through those office doors. Hit the like button right now if you believe hardworking parents deserve better than what this world gives them. At Nexus Shield Technologies, the morning shift was already buzzing. Engineers moved between monitors. Security dashboards scrolled with live data. The office sat on the 14th floor of a glass building overlooking Elliott Bay, all sharp edges and cold light, the kind of place that looked impressive from the outside and felt relentless from within. Ryder badged in at 7-3A. 2 colleagues glanced up. One whispered something to the other. He caught the word tired before they looked away. He was used to it. At the far end of the floor, the executive suite doors were already open. Through the glass wall, Vanessa Hart stood at the head of a conference table, arms crossed, reviewing a presentation nobody in the room looked happy about. She was 44, razor sharp, and had built Nexus Shield from a 12-person startup into a company worth over $1 billion. She demanded excellence, she accepted nothing less, and she had never once learned Ryder Cole's last name. He settled into his workstation, opened his monitoring dashboard, and began the morning security scan. Routine, familiar, quiet. Then, 7:22 a.m., one alert appeared on his screen. Small, easy to miss. He also scrolled past it, but something made him stop. He leaned forward, read it twice, then a third time, and somewhere deep in his chest, something cold shifted. Because the alert wasn't random, it was a pattern. And he had seen this pattern before, in a classified case study about an attack that had taken down 3 European financial networks in a single night. His fingers moved to the keyboard. Before he could type a single line of code, every screen in the cybersecurity division turned red simultaneously. The room went silent, then the alarm sounded, and across every monitor, in bold white letters against a field of red, 2 words appeared that made every engineer in the room go pale. Critical breach detected. Every phone on the floor rang at once. Ryder was already standing. The red glow from a dozen screens painted the entire department in alarm light. Senior engineers scrambled from their chairs. Someone knocked over a coffee mug. Nobody stopped to clean it up. The breach alert was cascading across every monitor, bouncing between systems like a signal looking for somewhere to land. "Which sector?" Someone shouted from across the room. "Financial, multiple institutions." Another voice, urgent, cracking at the edges. Ryder pulled up the raw traffic logs and scanned fast. His eyes moved the way they always did under pressure. Not panicked, but precise. Filtering, sorting, looking past the noise for the thing underneath it. And there it was. 7 financial institutions. Simultaneous. All mid-tier regional banks with shared back-end infrastructure. The attack wasn't brute force, it was surgical. Whoever had designed this had studied these systems. They knew exactly where the gaps were. The emergency response team activated within minutes. Lead engineers took positions. The floor transformed from an ordinary Monday morning into something that felt like a command center. Phones stayed pressed to ears. Keyboards clattered without stopping. Ryder called Maya, Piper's babysitter, at 8:04 a.m. "Hey, I'm going to be later than usual tonight, maybe a lot later." "How late are we talking?" Maya asked. "I honestly don't know yet." A pause. "I'll stay with her. Don't worry." Tell her, he stopped, exhaled. Tell her I'll call before she goes to sleep. He hung up before Maya could respond. There was no time for anything else. For the next 4 hours, the team worked in waves. Block an entry point. The attackers rerouted. Close a vulnerability, they found another. The assault was adaptive. Every time Nexus Shield's defense tightened, the intrusion shifted direction like water finding cracks in stone. By early afternoon, the team lead declared a partial victory. Several breach points had been sealed. Transaction systems at 3 of the 7 banks had been stabilized. The mood in the room lifted slightly. Engineers exhaled. Someone suggested ordering food. Ryder didn't exhale. He was staring at a single line of code that had been repeating at irregular intervals. Not loudly, not obviously, just quietly cycling through the background traffic like a heartbeat nobody was listening to. He traced it backward through 3 server relays, then 4, then 5. It didn't match the attack pattern they'd been fighting all day. It was something else entirely. Something that had been running the entire time, invisible beneath the chaos, patient in a way that made the hair on the back of his neck stand straight. The rest of the team was celebrating around him, ordering sandwiches, loosening their shoulders, calling it a win. Ryder pushed his chair back, walked to the secondary analysis terminal in the corner of the room, and plugged directly into the back-end server traffic. His stomach dropped. What he found wasn't a second wave of the same attack. It was a completely separate breach, different origin, different architecture, different target entirely. And it had been hiding inside their own network this entire time. Nobody went home that night. At least, not the people who understood what they were still fighting. By 9 p.m., half the response team had rotated out. Shift change protocol, standard procedure. Fresh engineers came in with hot coffee and clean eyes. The ones leaving padded shoulders promised to check back in the morning and disappeared into the elevator. Ryder didn't move. He had removed his jacket 2 hours earlier. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows. An untouched sandwich sat at the edge of his desk, still in its wrapper. He hadn't eaten since the pancakes he'd made for Piper that morning, and even those felt like they belonged to a different life now. The secondary breach was unlike anything in Nexus Shield's incident library. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't loud, it moved through their systems the way fog moves through a valley, slow, quiet, and everywhere before you realized it had arrived. Every time Ryder isolated a segment of it, the rest of the intrusion simply waited, then continued. He built a containment model at 10:30 p.m. It held for 40 minutes, then collapsed. At midnight, his phone buzzed, a voicemail from Piper. He plugged in one earbud and played it without stopping his work. Daddy, Maya said you're really busy. That's okay. I saved you some of my dinner. It's in the fridge with your name on it. I spelled it right this time. Ryder. Maya helped a little. Okay, I love you. Come home soon. He listened to it twice, then set the phone face down and kept working, because what else could he do? The option to stop didn't exist. Not really. Not when he was the only engineer in the building who had mapped the full architecture of this second intrusion. Walking away now would mean handing a stranger a half-assembled lock and asking them to figure out the rest. He couldn't do that, so he didn't. Around 2 a.m., the secondary breach activity slowed, the signal weakened. The irregular cycling pattern that had been gnawing at Ryder's attention for hours began to space out, longer gaps between pulses, less data moving through the compromised channels. For the first time since morning, he sat back in his chair. He allowed himself to believe, just for a moment, that the worst of it might be over. The room was quiet. One other engineer was still present, young, barely 2 years out of college, asleep on a couch in the corner with his laptop still open on his chest. Ryder turned back to the monitor, and the belief evaporated. Because the breach hadn't slowed down, it had redirected. The traffic wasn't disappearing, it was moving, consolidating, flowing toward a completely different class of target than any financial institution. He pulled up the destination signatures and cross-referenced them against the National Infrastructure Registry. His hands stopped moving. His mouth went dry. The hackers were never after the banks. The banks had been a distraction. Power grids. That was the target, not account numbers. Not transaction records, not wire transfers or routing codes. The entire financial attack, the chaos, the alarms, the 40-person emergency response had been designed as noise, a curtain. Something loud and obvious to keep every cybersecurity team in the region staring in the wrong direction while the real operation moved quietly towards something that could hurt far more people than a frozen bank account ever could. Ryder stared at the infrastructure signatures on his screen and felt the full weight of what he was looking at. Regional power distribution networks, 3 states, interlocked grid systems that fed electricity to hospitals, water treatment facilities, traffic management systems, and emergency dispatch centers. If these access points were compromised and the right commands were executed, entire cities could go dark without warning. He picked up the internal emergency line and called the overnight duty manager. The call lasted 90 seconds. By the time he hung up, two government agency representatives were already being patched in remotely. Department of Homeland Security, CISA. Their voices came through the conference line flat and controlled, the kind of controlled that meant they were managing something they hadn't fully processed yet. The operation expanded immediately. Federal protocols activated. Nexus Shield's role shifted from private cybersecurity firm to active participant in a national-level response. More engineers were pulled back in. The executive floor, dark and empty an hour ago, suddenly had lights on. But the command stayed at Ryder's workstation because he had the thread. He was the only one who had traced the attack from its origin through its disguise and into its real destination. Handing that off now meant starting over, and starting over meant time. And time was the one thing they didn't have. At 4:17 a.m., the attackers gained temporary access to a monitoring node connected to a regional distribution substation in western Washington. The room collectively held its breath. Ryder severed the connection in under 4 minutes. The access was brief, incomplete. No commands had been executed, no damage done, but the message was clear. They had gotten in once, they could get in again. Ryder rebuilt the isolation barrier around the node and spent the next hour stress testing every adjacent connection point. His eyes burned. His lower back had gone from aching to simply numb. He had stopped noticing hunger 2 hours ago. At 6 a.m., a federal coordinator asked how long he'd been on. Since yesterday morning, Ryder said. A pause. You need a relief engineer. I need whoever compromised that monitoring node identified before they try again, Ryder said. Send me the access logs from the last 6 hours. All of them, internal and external. The coordinator went quiet for a moment, then sent the logs. Ryder opened the file, cross-referenced the timestamps, and stopped. Because buried inside the access history, between automated system pings and legitimate engineer logins, was a set of credentials that had no business being anywhere near that substation node. Active credentials, belonging to someone currently employed at Nexus Shield. He didn't tell anyone right away. That was the first decision, and it was deliberate. Because the moment he said the words out loud, "We have an insider," the entire response operation would fracture. Engineers would start watching each other. Trust would collapse. And whoever was feeding information to the outside would know they'd been noticed and vanish before leaving a single trace. So Ryder kept it quiet and moved carefully. He created a duplicate of the access logs under a private partition and began building a timeline. Every login, every query, every file touched in the 6 hours surrounding the substation breach. He mapped it against physical badge records, VPN timestamps, and internal communication logs, the kind of cross-referencing that took most forensic teams days to complete. He did it in 3 hours on no sleep, with Piper's voicemail still sitting in his phone like a small warm anchor at the edge of a very cold sea. The picture that emerged was careful, deliberate. Someone had been moving through Nexus Shield's internal systems in short, irregular bursts, never long enough to trigger automated anomaly detection, always through legitimate credential channels, always timed to coincide with high-traffic moments when the logs were loudest and most likely to be skimmed rather than read. Professional patient, inside. By 9 a.m., the access pattern pointed toward a single workstation in the third-floor infrastructure support division. Ryder cross-referenced the workstation ID against employee records. A name came up. He sat with it for a long moment, then pulled the employee's full access history for the past 60 days. What he found wasn't a smoking gun. It was quieter than that, a slow accumulation of small, almost invisible choices. Files accessed outside normal job scope. Queries run during off hours. 2 instances of data packets routed through an external relay that had since been deleted from the logs, except Ryder had a copy of the original traffic cache, pulled automatically by a background script he'd written 8 months ago for exactly this kind of situation. He had a name, he had evidence, and then at 10:43 a.m. something happened that he did not expect. A federal coordinator forwarded him a flagged report, a secondary analysis run by the DHS overnight team that had cross-referenced unusual access patterns with all personnel who had direct contact with the compromised systems. Ryder opened the report, scrolled to the flagged entries, and found his own name at the top of the list, his credentials, his workstation, his access timestamps, reframed, recontextualized, stripped of the defensive work that explained every single one of them, presented as a pattern of suspicious internal activity. Someone hadn't just been feeding information to the outside. They had been building a case against him. Ryder didn't panic. Panic was a luxury he hadn't been able to afford since the night Piper's mother died, and he wasn't about to start now. He closed the federal report, reopened his private partition, and began the only logical response available to him. He started building his own defense. Every action he had taken over the past 40-plus hours was logged somewhere. Keystrokes, command histories, server-side timestamps. The work he'd done wasn't just documented, It was embedded in the architecture of every barrier currently standing between those power grids and the people who wanted them dark. You couldn't fake that kind of trail, you could only follow it, and Ryder knew exactly how to follow it. He constructed a parallel timeline, his own activity mapped against the attack progression, showing not just what he had accessed but why, cross-referenced against the defensive actions that had resulted from each query. Every suspicious-looking timestamp had a corresponding security patch behind it. Every flagged credential use led directly to a sealed breach point. The picture wasn't of a man helping an attack. It was of a man holding one back with both hands. At noon, two members of the federal response team entered the operations floor and asked to speak with him privately. He walked them through the full timeline without being asked twice, showed them the traffic cache, showed them the insider's access pattern, showed them his own records, clean and sequential, each entry traceable to a documented defensive action. One of the agents took notes without speaking. The other watched Ryder's face the entire time. When he finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then the first agent said, "You built all of this tonight?" "Last night and this morning," Ryder said. "I've been here since yesterday at 7. Another silence. Meanwhile, the hackers weren't waiting. At 1:30 p.m., the external assault shifted back into high gear. A second infrastructure node, this one connected to a hospital backup power system in Tacoma, began registering unauthorized access attempts rapid, escalating, more aggressive than anything in the previous 24 hours. 3 engineers collapsed from exhaustion between 1 p.m. and 3 p.m. One was sent home. 2 refused to leave and were moved to a rest area set up in a conference room down the hall. Ryder stayed at his workstation. His hands were shaking slightly now, not from fear, but from the specific tremor that arrives when a human body has been running on caffeine and adrenaline long past its natural limit. He pressed his palms flat against the desk for a moment, steadied them, and kept working. At 4:48 p.m., he isolated the Tacoma node completely. At 5:33 p.m., he identified and traced the final external relay the hackers were using to bounce their commands, a compromised server sitting inside a logistics company in eastern Oregon that had no idea it was being used as a weapon. At 6:07 p.m., Ryder executed a coordinated shutdown sequence that collapsed the attack infrastructure entirely. The breach signatures flatlined. Every monitor in the room returned to its normal color. For 3 full seconds, nobody said anything. Then, from somewhere across the floor, a single person started clapping, others joined. The federal coordinator's voice came through the conference line, measured, professional, and for the first time in 2 days, something close to relieved. Nexus Shield, the threat has been neutralized. Outstanding work. Ryder leaned back in his chair. He closed his eyes. Just for a second, just 1 second. But the hackers had one final move, and it was already in motion before the applause died down. The final alert came at 6:19 p.m. A residual script, a last automated command buried so deep in the compromised relay that it had survived the shutdown sequence, had triggered a low-level probe against the primary Eastern Washington distribution node. Not a breach, not even close to one, a ghost. The kind of thing that would have been caught and neutralized by the overnight monitoring team within the hour. Ryder caught it in 4 minutes, wrote the patch in 7, deployed it in 2, done. He sat back again, and this time the adrenaline didn't return to pull him upright. His body had been waiting for that signal, the one that said the battle was genuinely over, and the moment it arrived, everything he had been holding back for 48 hours came down at once. His shoulders dropped, his breathing slowed. The noise of the operations floor, keyboards, phone calls, the hum of server racks, softened into something distant and blurred, like sound heard through water. He told himself he would review the final incident summary. He opened the document, read the first paragraph, and somewhere between the second and third sentence, Ryder Cole closed his eyes and did not open them again. His head came to rest against his forearm on the desk. His breathing deepened. For the first time in 48 hours, he slept. The operations floor continued around him. Engineers moved between stations. Phones rang. Someone refilled the coffee machine down the hall. Nobody woke him. Most of them had watched him work through 2 sunrises without stopping. A few had quietly agreed without saying so that the man had earned exactly what he was doing. At 8:54 a.m. the following morning, the executive elevator opened. Vanessa Hart stepped onto the operations floor carrying a leather portfolio and the expression of someone who had already decided what kind of morning it was going to be. She had been briefed on the attack in broad strokes. Crisis resolved. System secured. No public-facing damage. She had spent the previous evening on calls with investors, reassuring them that Nexus Shield's protocols had performed exactly as designed, confident language that required her to project certainty she hadn't yet fully verified. Now she needed the floor operating at full capacity. She moved through the department with purpose. Her eyes swept the room the way they always did. cataloging, evaluating, measuring the energy of the space against her expectations of it. And then she saw him, a man, asleep at his workstation, head down, completely still. The room didn't quiet this time, it froze. Every person who saw her see him understood what was coming. Several looked away. One junior engineer opened his mouth, then closed it. A senior analyst 3 desks away took a slow breath and stared at his monitor. Nobody spoke. Vanessa crossed the floor in 12 steps. She stopped directly beside Ryder's desk, looked at him for a long moment, and her voice, when it came, was the kind of quiet that is somehow louder than shouting. "Wake up!" Ryder's head came up, eyes open, disoriented, the way a person looks when their body has been dragged out of the first real sleep it has had in 2 days. He looked at the screen, then at his hands, then at the woman standing over him. "This is unacceptable," Vanessa said. "We don't pay people to sleep on the job." He opened his mouth. She didn't wait for what came out of it. "Pack your things. Effective immediately. You're terminated." The words landed like something physical, not just on Ryder, on the entire room. Every engineer within earshot stopped what they were doing. Screens went unwatched, keyboards went untouched. The floor held its breath in the specific way that spaces hold breath when something irreversible is happening and everyone present knows it, and no one is moving to stop it. Ryder stood slowly. He was still wearing yesterday's shirt. His eyes were red at the edges. There were coffee rings on the desk beside his keyboard, and the ghost of Piper's voicemail still sat in his phone, saved, undeleted. He looked at Vanessa. "I worked through the night," he said. His voice was level. "Quiet both nights." "I'm not interested in excuses," she said. "I stopped the breach," he said. "The infrastructure nodes, the power grid attack. I was the only engineer who security will escort you out." She turned away before he finished the sentence. "Leave your badge at the front desk." The room stayed frozen. 2 security officers appeared at the floor entrance within minutes. Protocol, efficient, nothing personal in their expressions. They waited at a respectful distance. Ryder looked once at the monitor where his incident timeline was still open. At the patch he had deployed 11 hours after his last meal. At the voicemail notification still sitting at the bottom of his screen. Then he picked up his jacket, walked to his desk drawer, took out a small photo of Piper, the one where she was missing her 2 front teeth, and holding a fish they'd caught together at a lake in Oregon last summer, and tucked it under his arm. He didn't say anything else. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't look for allies in the room, though several pairs of eyes followed him with expressions that said more than any of them were willing to say out loud. His badge was disabled before he reached the lobby. The glass doors slid shut behind him. For a long moment he stood in the morning air outside the building and simply breathed. Back upstairs, the room stayed quiet well past the point it should have returned to normal. Vanessa had already retreated to the executive floor. The message, as she intended it, had been delivered. Performance standards at Nexus Shield were non-negotiable, regardless of circumstance. But the message people in that room were actually receiving was something different. At 11:30 a.m., the board of directors convened an emergency review of the Cyberattack incident, standard post-crisis procedure. The request had come in before the firing: routine documentation, timeline reconstruction, damage assessment. The investigators began pulling logs. At 12:17 p.m., a board member named Gerald Ossie paused over a timestamp in the incident record. He scrolled back, cross-referenced it against the employee activity report, then against the badge entry log. His expression shifted. He pulled the full 48-hour timeline and laid it flat across the conference table. And as the numbers arranged themselves into a picture he had not expected to see, Gerald Ossie set his pen down very carefully and looked up at the rest of the room. "When exactly," he said slowly, "was Ryder Cole terminated?" The boardroom went still. Gerald Ossie slid the incident timeline to the center of the table without saying anything else. He didn't need to. The document spoke at a volume that filled the room completely. 48 hours of continuous logged activity. One engineer's credentials running through the entire defensive operation from the first alert to the final patch. No rotation, no relief, no gaps longer than 4 minutes across 2 full days and 2 full nights. A board member named Patricia Wynn pulled the file toward her and read in silence for 30 seconds. "He was here the entire time?" she asked. "Every timestamp confirmed," said the lead investigator. "Badge records match. Server logs match. The patch sequences are traceable to his workstation exclusively. There is no other engineer whose activity comes close to the scope of what this individual executed over this period." "And the infrastructure nodes?" Gerald asked. "He identified the redirect. He isolated both compromised nodes. He built the containment model that the federal team used as the operational framework for the final shutdown." The investigator paused. "Without his intervention, DHS's preliminary estimate puts potential grid disruption at 4 to 6 hours across 3 states. We're talking hospitals, emergency services, water treatment. The exposure was significant." Patricia set the file down. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Gerald said, "And Vanessa fired him this morning for sleeping at his desk." It wasn't a question. The silence that followed was a specific kind. The kind that arrives when a room full of intelligent people processes an injustice that is so complete, so unnecessary, so entirely avoidable, that the only immediate response is the absence of words. By 3 p.m., the full incident report had been distributed to every board member. By 4 p.m., 3 senior engineers had submitted written accounts of what they had personally witnessed over the 48-hour period, unprompted, independently within 2 hours of each other. By 5 p.m., 2 engineers had submitted resignation notices citing leadership concerns. By 6 p.m., the story had leaked to an industry publication. Vanessa received the board's summary document at 6:34 p.m. She read it standing at her office window. The Seattle skyline silver and indifferent behind the glass. She read every page, every timestamp, every notation. She read the federal coordinator's commendation, submitted separately, praising the unnamed Nexus Shield engineer whose sustained effort had been, in the coordinator's words, the single most critical factor in preventing infrastructure compromise. Unnamed, because she had fired him before anyone thought to record his name in the official commendation. She set the document on her desk, sat down, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, Vanessa Hart had no prepared response, no language ready, no position to defend. Just the clean, unobstructed understanding of what she had done and what it had cost. Not the company, not the board, not the public narrative, what it had cost him. A man who had worked 48 hours without stopping, who had protected a company that didn't know his last name, who had gone home, had been escorted from the building, carrying nothing but a jacket and a photograph of his daughter. She picked up her phone, asked her assistant for Ryder Cole's home address. Ryder was in the backyard when the knock came. He and Piper had spent the afternoon doing nothing in particular, which was, he was realizing, one of the most valuable things a person could do. They had eaten lunch on the back steps. She had shown him a caterpillar she found near the fence. He had helped her build a small obstacle course for it out of sticks and bottle caps, and they had watched it ignore every single obstacle with complete indifference, which Piper found absolutely hilarious. He felt something loosening in his chest that had been tight for a very long time. Maya answered the front door and came to find him with an expression he couldn't immediately read. "There's a woman at the door," Maya said. "She says her name is Vanessa Hart." Ryder looked at her for a moment, then handed Piper the stick she'd been using to redirect the caterpillar. "Keep it on the course," he said. "It doesn't listen," Piper said seriously. "Neither do most people," he said. "Try anyway." He walked through the house and opened the front door. Vanessa stood on his porch without her portfolio, without her assistant, without the particular armor of certainty she carried everywhere she went. She looked like what she was, a person who had driven to a stranger's house because there was no professional framework available for what she needed to do. "I owe you an apology," she said, "not a company statement, not a legal arrangement, an apology." Ryder leaned against the doorframe and waited. She gave it to him, all of it, without softening the edges or redirecting responsibility. She had made an assumption. She had acted on it without asking a single question. She had humiliated a man in front of his colleagues for doing the most extraordinary version of his job that the company had likely ever seen. She said it plainly, completely. When she finished, she told him the board wanted him back, full reinstatement, promotion to senior director of cybersecurity operations, a compensation package that included back pay, a significant raise, and a flexibility agreement that would never again require him to choose between a crisis and his daughter. She told him the offer was real and that she understood if he needed time. Ryder looked at her for a long moment. "I appreciate that," he said. "I do." "But," she said, "but Piper's got a science fair in 3 weeks, and the job I've already been offered doesn't have emergency overnight shifts. It has remote options, school pickup flexibility, and a team that apparently already knows my name." He paused. "I think I'm going to be okay." Vanessa nodded slowly. She didn't argue. She didn't try to renegotiate. She extended her hand and he shook it. "For what it's worth," she said quietly. "What you did in there, what you held together for 2 days without anyone asking you to, I won't forget it." "I wasn't doing it for recognition," he said. "I know," she said. "That's exactly what I won't forget." She walked back to her car. Ryder stood in the doorway a moment longer, watching the street settle back into its ordinary afternoon quiet. Then he walked through the house and back into the yard, where Piper was still crouched over her obstacle course, narrating the caterpillar's journey in complete seriousness to an audience of 0. He sat down on the step beside her. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. A number he didn't recognize. A brief message below it identifying the caller as the chief security officer of a firm he'd heard of but never applied to, Mr. Cole. "We've followed what happened. We'd like to talk when you're ready. No rush." He looked at it for a moment, then set the phone face down on the step. The caterpillar had finally cleared an obstacle. A bottle cap piper had propped at an angle, and she threw both arms up like it was a championship. Moment, did you see that? She yelled. I saw it, Ryder said. He did it. He did. She looked at her father with the kind of satisfaction that belongs only to people who haven't yet learned to expect the world to disappoint them. And Ryder Cole, single father, 48-hour defender of 3 states of electricity, man who had been escorted from a building that morning for the crime of finally sleeping, smiled back at his daughter like a person who had just remembered what he was actually fighting for. Some doors close hard, some close quietly, but every single one that closes on the wrong place has a way of making the right one easier to find, and sometimes the phone rings at exactly the right moment, not to pull you back into the storm, but to remind you that the storm made you into someone worth calling. If this story moved you, share it with someone who deserves to hear it. And if you're carrying more than anyone knows, keep going. The right people will notice.